We're going to move to the next presentation, which is an industry expert talking to us about, can a data fabric overcome agility challenge hindering generative AI? And with us, we're going to have Terry Dorsey, who's a senior data architect and evangelist at Denodo. Terry? There you are.
Oh, just in case.
Please.
Good morning, everyone. Just looking to see if my slides are up.
Yeah. You don't need me, right?
Yes, I'm good.
I'll be here.
Can everybody hear me? Okay, good. As he said, my name is Terry Dorsey. I'm with Denodo, but prior to joining Denodo, I worked for McCormick Company, which is a very large and global spice company. Just as you are today, you know, this idea, this push and this need and this desire for generative AI, back in 2017, McCormick Company had a similar desire, right? And in that space, it was a matter for us to be able to do the strategic project around creating product formulations for some of our products. And so this idea of getting all of these advantages from generative AI is not foreign to us, right? And so back in 2017, before we had many of the things that we have today, one of our biggest thrusts were a matter of bringing our workforce, our product development force, up to the same level as our expert developers, along with gaining customer intimacy and all those other good things that come with initiatives that help drive growth. Just as today, the challenges that people have around launching into artificial intelligence, we had those similar challenges, right? It's very hard if we look at our data landscapes, right? Even at that time in 2017, this was the time that everything was moving into the cloud. There were migrations happening and a lot of things, just a lot of flux within the organization. And if you take a global organization, it's even more complicated. This idea around having all these systems, having where you're going to get these resources. What we did at McCormick, we decided that we would leverage external resources. At the time, the IBM Watson team were the experts in that field. And the idea was to work with them. And so when I look at some of the challenges we had at that time, and probably a lot of you have those similar challenges today, right? We have this idea, this pace of innovation, things changing. Today, the LLMs and a lot of the ways of interacting with those LLMs and just the industry in that space is changing so quickly. Just as our organizations are changing, right? There's migrations, transformations, new projects, automations. All of these things have some type of influence or some type of dependence, that AI would have this dependence on these types of things. Uncertainty, right? We had a lot of uncertainty. We had, at the time, we were SAP, and so we were in the middle of a migration or at the beginning of a migration. We were moving into the cloud. We were moving things into SaaS, and so, just things were just all over the place. And when you start to embark on these artificial intelligence projects, you have to take that into consideration, right? So I don't know what I'm going to be dealing with. I don't know when. I don't know what's going to change. But I need to make sure that I'm going to move my project forward. We were also a global company, so we had restrictions and regulations that we had to adhere to, as well as language barriers and many other things that you can associate with globalization. Today, and even back in 2017, the way people actually started to think about interacting with data, there were different modes. People, they were using their spreadsheet and they had their spreadsheet economies, but everybody was now moving into this area where they wanted to get access to information, be able to do this self-serve and visualization. So all of these things were things that we had to take into consideration. The volatility, IP protection. Many of you may not know that McCormick Company holds the trade secrets of many other organizations. And so those product formulations that we were generating, a lot of those were even trade secrets. Transformations, right? There's SAP transformations, but there's different parts of the organizations that are moving at different times, right? It's almost like you're this juggling act of how you're going to actually keep in line with what's going on in the organization, but move your project forward. And oh, by the way, be able to support it and maintain it going forward, right? And so all of these things were things that we had to take into consideration. And this idea of how can I still be agile with so much going on within the organization. Today, we're very lucky to have LLMs and this concept of generative AI and things being more accessible. Back then, for us, it was all custom, but the parallels are still the same. There's this idea that we have developers and data scientists that can build these models, and they have the know-how to do that. Today, it's even faster that they have access to those. But the problems still remain is that these developers, they don't necessarily have this business knowledge or know-how or process knowledge that your organization has. They may be able to create models and write programs and things like that, but this idea of having to put that responsibility onto product or these developers is something that is really not feasible in the long term. And so when taking all of these things into consideration, what we end up having to do is it's almost like a three-legged stool, right? You have your data scientists and your artificial intelligence experts, but you still have this portion of your technology organization that has to figure out a way to feed that so that that complexity is reduced, right? So if you think about it, back in 2017, we were contracting with IBM. Think of the amount of costs that we would have. And if I were to ask IBM to engineer data and do security, I would not be using my financial resources to the best way that I could. So the idea is, how do you do that? How do you make sure that you can give access to the information on your enterprise, maintain that supportability, keep track of all of the moving parts in your organization, and move your project forward? Incidentally enough, this survey was done by an MIT Technology Review back in 2022, and it's I feel very relevant today, right? A lot of leaders that were interviewed said that most of the challenges or most of the impediments that have to do with how do you actually scale and move these types of projects forward have to do with unified data platform, the speed of processing, and these other things are listed where the percentages go down somewhat. And I can speak from experience that the idea of this unified place or accessing or working plays very well into being able to move these projects forward. Case in point, 2017, we started our project from scratch, nothing, third-party people, a lot of security requirements, not even servers, right? So to actually run it. In 2018, we had a fully functioning operational model where our product developers were actually engaging with it and creating product formalizations. As a matter of fact, we pit our product developers against our AI, and in 2 out of 3 of those cases, the AI beat our product developers in creating products that tasted better. And the question becomes, how do we do that conceptually, and also technologically, if you think about it? And being that I have this software engineering background, and my responsibility at that time, I was the lead architect and technologist for that project, as well as an AI consultant internally. And if you think about it from a software engineering, the idea of abstraction plays very well, right? In that we could abstract the enterprise so that our very high-priced artificial intelligence experts could interact with the enterprise while the enterprise was moving, while the enterprise was changing, while we were going through transformation, while systems were moving in and out, while we were moving onto the cloud, and why SAP, well, just the migration is still in process, and why SAP was still migrating. And there's this idea of being able to access what you don't know, what you may need, when you need it, quickly, so that you can iterate quickly, how you can present that to these developers so that they have an understanding of what those things are in your business without you have to go through a lot of explaining or a lot of work that these artificial intelligence experts need to do, right? And so there's this conversation with the business, this understanding of the processes. But when they got access to the enterprise, it was abstracted in a way so that they could leverage it based on the conversations that they had. That allowed that project to move very quickly. We had 2-week sprints, and so we were able to iterate very quickly. And as far as what we delivered from the enterprise, there were 60 endpoints from the enterprise that were delivered. And they covered the bulk, right? So manufacturing, sales, external, regulations and things from the outside. But our developers were insulated from that. Consistent interface to that, consistent interface to the metadata, security, because we hold trade secret information, we actually had to mask that information. So that when IBM was working with our data, they had to be able to work with it, still get the patterns that were in our data without really seeing our data. Governance and security come into play, what IBM was allowed to work with, how we were able to present that information so it could be validated and sent into the AI. And this concept of simplified interoperability. And that's where abstraction and encapsulation come into play. And the way that looks from an architectural standpoint, if you think about what a data fabric does, it allows you to connect to all of these different disparate sources. For us, we had some that were external APIs, some things that came from SaaS applications, some things that came from spreadsheets, some things that came from SAP, some things that came from product development systems and other systems within and without the organization. And this idea that we could connect to them, create a logical representation of what they were, so that when we coded to them, we didn't have to worry about what was happening within the rest of the organization. And finally, deliver those abstractions of the enterprise in the format necessary. For the work that we did, it was API-based, it was REST-based. But if we think about some of the ways that we can interact with LLMs today, there could be other interfaces or other delivery mechanisms for that. And so there was this idea of creating the enterprise in an abstracted layer and working with the abstraction as opposed to the different parts of the enterprise. And it worked very well, as I said. In 2018, we had a functioning artificial intelligence, and in 2019, there were products on the market that were generated by this artificial intelligence. You can Google it today, McCormick. There's many references to it and press releases around that. And so we were very successful in doing that. So when I think about the parallels of what we did, right, we had data scientists. Data scientists can create how we actually interact and how the models that we created. And we can think about how that works with Gen AI today, right? So Gen AI can do some amazing things. Some of the strengths, and I think somebody mentioned them earlier today, is we can create queries from natural language. We can summarize information. They can review, assess, and rate information. And they can provide insight and make decisions as to whether functions can be called. And so these LLMs, the common denominator through all this functionality is they work through words and text. Right? So imagine when we talk about these unified layers and we talk about semantics, we can now manipulate the text of those assets, services, or whatever, so that the LLM can work within them. And so the first use case I'm going to talk about briefly, because I'm going to kind of cycle through how that would actually work, right? So the first use case is this natural language to SQL. And this use case, when we think about the corporation and the enterprise, a lot of our information is still structured, and the information that drives many organizations is structured information. And this ability to be able to get through it by talking to an LLM, having it generate the question to the enterprise and bring that information back is very powerful. If we think about all of the work that we've done and attempts we've made at doing analytics and self-serve, think about what this use case offers now. This ability to talk to the enterprise and get answers back and not have to create a myriad of data sets in order to do that. And the idea that this can be generated or deployed out to regular business users within the organization. And to some extent, they can actually control these processes through the metadata and the semantics associated with it. The second use case this is one that we hear a lot about, and this is the RAG model where we have our unstructured data, we index it, we search it, and we bring that in, and we basically have the LLM summarize that information and perhaps provide some insights on it. But this can also be extended to that structured model, to structured data that can be provided and indexed either through APIs or as a summarization of queries that are sent into the enterprise. The third use case, and this is the one use case that we used a lot within the McCormick application, and this was the ability to take the information from the enterprise and serve it up so that models could be generated. And in the case of McCormick, our models were feeding 24/7 because they were actually pulling information from the enterprise at real time, because when it came to developing, you wanted to make sure that your developers had fresh models to work with. And in some instances, that information was even modeled in real time between the interactions that those users had. So this ability to deliver that information securely and in this consistent format while all the chaos is going in the organization was something that we were able to do. This is a very, very important use case for us. And then finally, this idea, and I think somebody mentioned it earlier, this idea of autonomous agents. Well, the way LLMs work is I can ask an LLM a question, and I can provide information about not only what I have in my enterprise, but I can provide information about agents and services that I have in my enterprise, and it can, given the right text and descriptions, it can determine whether I need to call those agents, and it can give me the information to call them. This opens up possibilities for updating applications without having to write a whole lot of stuff around applications or being able to trigger events within our system. And it's all around being able to provide the metadata for those web services and descriptive information enough for the LLM to make those decisions. And so the question now becomes, can I democratize that? And so what I decided to do was I created a framework. And this is because typically the way modeling and work does in that space is I literally can create a prototype for an LLM application within an hour. Get my coding right and debug it all, and maybe get the LLM to help me debug it. But I can create this templatized framework. And then I can then reuse, and the question now is, can I reuse that framework and just bring in information across my enterprise without having to rewrite or rework my framework, right? And so the example that I have here is going to be this natural language to SQL. And natural language to SQL means that I can ask a question. In the actual prompt or information that I send to my LLM will say, here's my question, and here's the structure. These are the candidates of things you can use in order to generate that query. Execute that query. The results of that I can then send back to the LLM for it to summarize. And my framework doesn't really depend on the data. It's just a matter of giving me consistent metadata around what I need to do. Right? And so if I look at what a data fabric provides to me is I can take those assets. Here I have this requisition asset sitting in a space within my data fabric, and I can now carve out that space in the fabric for just requisitions. And if I only put requisitions in that space, that means that metadata will come back. It will generate a query on that. It can execute that query within that guarded space, within that space of the data fabric, based on the privileges of the requester, and the results can be returned, right? And so I have somebody, they come up, They have a question about a requisition. The Gen AI will then ask the data fabric, okay, here's the requisition area in that data fabric. What's in there? General. It's a general question and a structured response that comes back. That information is then provided to that LLM. The LLM generates that query, sends that query back into the data fabric based on the privileges of that user, and then that information is summarized and sent back. Now, unbeknownst to the Gen AI application, that query around that requisition is not really running on that requisition. It's actually running in different areas of the enterprise, right? And so my application is stable, the generation of my query is stable, the execution of it is stable, but when it comes to when it actually executes, whatever my organization looks like, however I've adjusted my organization, however I've moved data, I am now able to get my application to work stable. That means that once I create it, once I get my template in place, I'm totally decoupled from the enterprise at that point. And the management of that it's not on the onus of the developer anymore. All the developer needs to do is how to work with that metadata and how to send the request into the data fabric. And I can create as many areas in that data fabric, and I can put as many attributes in those areas, and I can put guardrails around how they execute. And I have that consistent connection or interoperability between my Gen AI applications. And this is kind of how the work that we did at McCormick worked, right? So as systems were moving, a lot of times, so for instance, if we had a product formulation, it would come from multiple systems. Those systems were structured differently, what was in those systems were different, but the representation of that product formula was the same. It was simple, it was in business terms. And the coding was to that representation so that the rest of the organization could move and adapt as it needed to. And so in my example here, we're going to add a delivery, and maybe that delivery is coming from some real-time provider, and you really can't even move that information into your enterprise, right? But with the help of a data fabric, that's not even a necessity, right? So what we're going to do here is we're going to look at this idea. Excuse the coding or the look. It was something I coded from scratch. But actually what we're going to see here is a web application that is actually working through that same process, right? I'm telling it that I want the requisitions area of the data fabric. I ask it a question. It goes through that process, gets the schema for it, and returns back. And in this example here, I have the LLM also provide a business explanation, a summary of the query, and the actual query that was generated. So there's a couple queries we have here. And so imagine what that looks like now, right? This idea of you have business users that I don't have to create data sets. If I can secure my logical entities, I know how to secure a requisition. I have rules in my company. I can secure it with policies. So now I can have this simple, very elegant interaction with my LLM, and I can actually get real value from and present it out to my business community. So say I want to make a change to my application. Right? Well, I don't have to change my framework because my framework is still operating the same way it did. But maybe I want to add vendor pricing, right? So what I do is I'll put an abstraction of vendor pricing in my area of the data fabric, and maybe this one goes out to some cloud store somewhere. Doesn't really matter. The interaction or between the LLM and the data fabric doesn't change, right? And so if I can now ask questions about vendor pricing, to my data fabric. I can, I don't know if we notice in some of them, even the joins are happening well because LLMs have gotten very, very good at actually creating those queries given the schema that are provided to it. And so here, maybe somebody wants to know who's the best vendor that I should use to buy something, or maybe who's the worst vendor to buy something. So I can now start asking meaningful questions to my enterprise through through my data fabric. And I can scale or grow as I need to, just by creating these assets, abstracted against my enterprise, dropping them into areas of the fabric. And it's not just limited to these areas of the fabric, right? So when I create requisitions or loans, I can report on them. I can leverage them through an API. I'm not restricted to just an AI. I can do however I need to. I can connect through REST or OData or ODBC, whatever mechanism that I need to do that with the security intact, right? And so it becomes a very elegant, very clean solution. And the ability to scale and move are there. And I can attribute the fact that we were able to move so quickly within that 1 year from nothing to being able to have our AI beat product developers within 1 year. And this doesn't minimize the work that it takes to do that. There's still your business, your processes, your validating, your data scientists working, and your IT people trying to just hold it all together, right, in order to do that. Oh, what happened? Oh, did I do that? Oh, okay. So the final one, and this goes kind of back to, I think, the fourth use case. So the fourth use case is around, how do I now extend this to services? Well, the data fabric can provide services. And the beauty of that is, I can take the same service, I can put it in an area, and if I change the description, change some of the mandatory things around that, it will behave differently because LLMs understand language. And so in this scenario here, I decided that I would create a logger and incorporate this functional part in the framework. And so what the framework does is it gets information about web services that are in my area of the data fabric, and it sends my information along with that to the LLM, and the LLM will decide whether it needs to call that function based on the descriptions, the directions and the descriptions, and what's going on throughout that interaction. And so in this next example here, this logger is tied to a database, and there's actually a REST service that's represented through that logger. And so what I decided to do was take the output from my query, give it to the LLM, and the description and the directions and the description for that logger are, if there is no errors or no problems with it, don't log it. If I have issues or if there's something not quite right about my interaction, log it. And because I'm in a data fabric, and because that fabric is available to me, I can now report on that interaction. So if I had error messages or if I had some questionable responses, the LLM is really quite good at providing that kind of feedback, right? And so I can kind of like vet or assess how well my application is running. Here we'll say, and a lot of this was based on my testing, but you can see that the severity and the satisfaction. So basically there's two functions, one that will log issues and one that will look at the entire interaction of that user and rate it and provide that information back. And because I'm in a data fabric, I can put Power BI in front of it, and I can also look at some of those responses. And you can, I don't know if you can catch them or read them, but some of them are really quite insightful and quite good. Right. And so what does that mean to us? That means that we can divide and conquer, right? We can have our developers do their work, our security people do their work, business experts, data engineers, everybody can do their work within the enterprise and actually get things moving along. And I'm going to jump to these takeaways, right? So we can support many Gen AI use cases. There's actually this ability to democratize Gen AI to the business. You have this consistency of interoperability, that means support. And all the other things that come with that, simplify governance and security, and this unified data platform for scaling, which can help you overcome these data agility challenges within AI. And that's all I have. Thank you. You can.
For Terry.
Yeah.
We have a question over there. Any other ones? Okay.
I guess I'll just ask my question. Michelle here. how you can generate the questions from the LLMs into the database, turn them into SQL queries. What methods have you used to mitigate around unknown misunderstandings? Say, for example, if I'm looking at, I'd like to know how many of what's the average age of my customer, right? I've seen that done in the past as well, where I'm mining the data, but I'm getting an answer that is wrong. So you get this false sense of security because it's asking the question, or there is there's a disconnect between my understanding of the data and the question that I'm asking. I don't know if you've tried you've done anything to mitigate around those, I guess, false sense of security in the answers that we're getting.
Right. So, and the truth of the matter is that some of it is training and understanding that an LLM is basically a predictive model, right? And so some of the information that's provided was the business explanation along with this is actually what's happening, right? Number one. Number two, with a data fabric, this ability to take all of the complexity, right? So say in the case of the requisition, it's all over the enterprise. There may be different pieces, right? But what actually goes to the LLM is this business representation. So the probability of getting close to what you need is there, right? You can also look at some of the results. Like if you were to look at or review the loggers, you can also see where you have opportunities to augment, right? So maybe, you see that, this one's, these kind of questions, I can now maybe create another abstraction that may get me there. It wasn't shown here, but in the framework, there's examples that also go along with it as well. And I also have a term, right, where you can manage the terms and definitions, right? So these are things that increase your probability. But at the end of the day, we are dealing with the probabilistic model, right? I don't know if that helps or not. Yeah.
Yeah, hi, Terry. My name is Sandeep. So my question is basically around document summarizers, right? So typically when we deal with lots and lots of customer feedback data and all, and if we are using, APIs like OpenAI, GPT APIs, typically the results that we get, it's kind of unstable in a way. Over a period of time, we might get results which are like changing to some extent. In your experience, what are the typical guardrails that you put across just to make sure that the results that we are getting, it's stable throughout? I mean, if the input is same, the output should be same. How can we make sure about that? One solution is, of course, we can go ahead with, in-premise, open source language models. We can fine tune them in our own system, but it has a cost associated with it. So, if we have to go ahead with OpenAI APIs, then what are the typical guardrails that you use in your experience to make sure that results are consistent and stable?
Right, so first of all, and I think somebody mentioned, there's this idea of piloting or starting with a small community to assess things, right? There are also statistical analysis that you can run on some of the outputs to do that, but also keeping in mind that everything is not always a candidate for LLMs, right? There are other types of AI. Matter of fact, I think somebody mentioned the stats earlier, right? Less than 10% of the AI that's out there today is generative AI, right? And so, first of all, find the right application, right, for generative AI. In the case of unstructured data, there are unique challenges around that. And, and vectorization is only a way of getting you close to the semantics, right? So there's investigations into other prompting styles, right, you can do in order to do that, graph rag, in concert with vectorization. So these are things that are within the framework area of that you can experiment with. But again, it's not an exact science. These are predictive models, right?
Thank you, Terry, so much.
Thanks, everyone.
She's going to be around if you have any questions for her. Really appreciate it.